Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. What I wanted to do today is have a look at what builds have been doing well so far in the Necropolis expansion. Now, when I've done these videos in the past, I've focused on Trade League first, and then a little bit after that, I've done SSF. This time I wanted to try something a bit different. This league, I'm going to be looking at Solo Self-Found first, and then having a look at Trade League in a couple of days' time. It's worth noting that any build that's successful in Solo Self-Found will also work in Trade, although, of course, in Trade League, there's a few optimizations that become available, both to some of the top builds, they can become even better, but also to some of the builds that aren't quite on this list, can sometimes be catapulted above some of the builds that are on this list because of items that you can't realistically get in Solo Self-Found. So if you're a Trade League player, like I am myself, then you can definitely watch this video, then come back for a few new ideas when the next video comes out. A quick note on build diversity, Trade League build diversity is actually the highest it's ever been at the moment. Patch 3.24 has got the top build diversity of all time. However, this is not the case in Solo Self-Found. Solo Self-Found, there's more of a convergence on the best builds. We'll get to that in a sec, and you'll notice that Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction is going to be talked about a lot in this video. That's a good reason. It is a very, very dominant force in the 3.24 SSF meta. So what's our methodology here? Grinding Gear Games published the ladder. There's a list of the top 15,000 characters by XP. Now in Trade League, the cutoff for this is level 97 at the moment. So if you're not level 97 or above, then you won't appear on the current version of the ladder. In Solo Self-Found though, with a combination of a more difficult rule set and also less popularity of the game mode, level 82 is the cutoff currently, at least at the time I was recording this video. So that means that you get a slightly different mix if you just look at the ladder alone. Now I'm filtering to only show level 92 and above in this video, and by cutting it off at level 92, you ensure that you've still got thousands of characters showing up there. There's more than 5,000 people at a level 92 or above in Solo Self-Found at the moment, but you are also being a little bit picky as well. Anyway, the website POE.Ninja scrapes the ladder regularly, and if you've ever been scraped in one of these ladder data dumps, then they'll keep looking for you as well. And so using this, they're able to then get a huge amount of information about characters, not just the 15,000 currently on the ladder, but a bunch of people who were on it and have fallen off as well. That's why POE.Ninja has information on almost 100,000 characters in softcore trade enabled, and in softcore Solo Self-Found, while the numbers are a bit smaller, they're still pretty significant. It's worth noting that any of the 3 different game hard modes, this is the optional hardcore rule set, the optional ruthless rule set, or the optional SSF rule set, all of these make the game harder, and when the game is harder, people converge on a smaller subset of builds. Things that are proven to work well because it becomes more punishing in various different ways, are builds that aren't as strong. Additionally, the Solo Self-Found rule set can make it really difficult to get certain builds going. For instance, Wrathpinth Globe. I have had one of these drop this league, but the vast majority of players will not have had a Wrathpinth Globe, and that means that there's a number of builds that you probably wouldn't consider running unless you'd already had that item drop. Whereas in Trade League, if you want a Wrathpinth, all you need to do is just trade with someone that's already got one. Another big factor you want to be aware of though is that any build guide that gets popular, and realistically this is any build guide that gets more than about 30 or 40,000 views on YouTube, these can start having quite a noticeable impact on the league meta. For instance, if there was a build that was 7 out of 10 on some arbitrary scale and another build that was 8 out of 10, but the 7 out of 10 build had a fantastic well-written guide, then that's likely to result in it being played more than the arguably stronger build will be. We need to talk though about the Necropolis League expansion mechanic, the grave crafting. The original incarnation of grave crafting that existed in the first day of the league was actually incredibly strong, but most players didn't realise this, and there was a huge Reddit outcry that led to Grinding Gear Games actually buffing it further. So one of the most powerful crafting methods in the game got made better than it was, and this means that there's a huge impact for people's second builds. This hasn't really flowed on to the Solo Self-Found stats yet. Essentially, it's now extremely reliable to get extremely strong gear as long as you don't need influence gear and as long as you don't need extremely exotic bases. Even then, some types of exotic bases are also available. I think it's worth noting though that grave crafting is better at crafting some things than others, and attack-based weapons, this is an incredibly big buff to any build that is attacking with a weapon. Finally though, it's important to note that the player base worked out quite late just how good grave crafting is, and as a result, there's not been much of a flow-on effect. People tend to plan their builds in advance of the league, and then potentially make a second character sometime later. So people who have been inspired by what's been learned about grave crafting to make, for example, a Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow, or an Elemental Hitter, the Spectrum character, as their second character of the league, these players may not yet have leveled that second character, and so the build is still based around what was reliable before grave crafting existed. One little example I'd like to give here is that almost no one is using Discipline as an aura, and that's despite the fact that grave crafting makes crafting really high energy shield chest pieces and helmets far more accessible than it's been in the past. For example, it is very realistic to be able to put together a 550 energy shield, 82 total resist Val Regalia that is 6-linked, and to do this way easier in SSF than you've been able to in previous leagues. And you'll be able to go further than 550 ES if you're willing to try this a few times. Or alternately, if they didn't want to go with a Val Regalia, they could go with a Sadist Garb, they could go with a Saintly Chainmail, a Saint's Hauberk, all these sorts of alternatives. So now that players know they can reliably craft these, they might potentially make different build choices to what they made at the start of the league. All that said, let's talk about Transfigured gems and particularly the new ones of this league. One 3.24 gem has been a standout over and above the other 3.24 Transfigured gems, and that's Elemental Hit of the Spectrum. However, the real success story with the Transfigured gems isn't the ones that were added in 3.24, it's the ones that were added in patch 3.23. Specifically, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction has exploded in popularity. This gem was already really good last league, but now it is the best skill in the game. We'll come to that in a sec. What else from the patch had a big impact on the builds that are being played? Penance Brand of Dissipation got significantly nerfed in 3.24, but it got nerfed from God tier to solid, and the gem is still fine. However, basically no one is playing it. I think it's the most underrated skill in both Trade League and Solo Self-Found at the moment, but underrated doesn't necessarily mean that it should be the best skill in the league, just that it's much better than the level of play it's getting would indicate. Summon Raging Spirits went from a very popular build down to dumpster tier. It's not that it's completely unplayable after the nerfs, it's just that it got hit hard enough that players aren't really interested, and that there's other minions that are both new and fresh, and that are also probably just a smidgen better than SRS is now. Tornado Shot has gone from absolutely dominant in trade and solid in SSF, down to being still a force in trade but not anything dominant, and completely dead in Solo Self-Found. And there is exactly one brave soul that is trying to make Stormbrand of Indecision work now. That was the one nerf that actually did kill a skill, so congratulations to our level 92 Trickster who is still keeping the skill's dreams alive. There's been a huge shake-up though in the Ascendancies that are popular in Solo Self-Found. 3 of the old top 5 Ascendancies have been pushed down. None of them fell out of the top 10, but there's been quite a bit of turnover there. So Inquisitor and Deadeye remain in the top 5 Ascendancies, but Guardian, Pathfinder and Elementalist, which were all top 5 Ascendancies in the Solo Self-Found version of this video last league, have fallen out into that second group of 5 Ascendancies. Here's what the Ascendancy spread looks like in 3.24 Solo Self-Found so far. So you'll see that the Inquisitor, Necromancer and Hierophant are a very large section of this pie chart. And then beyond that, there's a section of Ascendancies that are looking pretty healthy. So about half of the Ascendancies are in a good spot, and about half of them are slightly less so. One thing that really stands out to me though is that the Assassin really doesn't have a spot in current day PathOfExile. When we come to the top performing build, you'll see that it's something that thematically the Assassin should be pretty good at, but it's the Inquisitor that is dominating there. The modern day Assassin is not the best at anything in PathOfExile. It has a specialization towards crit and another specialization towards poison. These two don't really overlap very well. And as a poison ascendancy, it's behind Pathfinder. It's probably also behind Occultist. As a critical strike ascendancy, it is miles behind the Inquisitor. The Assassin has no home in Solo Self-Found at the moment, and it has no home in trade either, and it's very unpopular in hardcore. There are 4 other ascendancies that are doing really badly at the moment in Solo Self-Found: the Berserker, the Ascendant, the Occultist, and the Raider. But all of them at least have something else going for them. None of them really shine anywhere, but all of them are at least reasonably good in at least one game mode, mostly trade-enabled softcore. Or in the case of the Raider, it's a good ascendancy for new players, even if it doesn't hold up that well once you get deep into endgame. But the Assassin is just in a terrible spot. No individual ascendancy is hegemonic this league, but the diversity is a bit better when we go over into Trade League. In Solo Self-Found, there are some ascendancies that are genuinely overperforming by quite a lot, but that's just one of the things about SSF. There are certain builds that just work better under a harder rule set. Now I've left Gladiator out of this discussion because Gladiator will live or die based upon bleed, and there was sort of a bleed buff in this league. There's a pretty good new set of bleed related boots that were added to the Uber Cirrus encounter, but that's not something that many people are going to get their hands on in the Solo Self-Found environment. Anyways, let's start our discussion of the top performing Solo Self-Found builds so far, with Cast on Critical Strike, Detonate Dead Inquisitor. Now, this one's an oddball in that it doesn't actually show up when you're doing a POE.Ninja search. That's because it technically doesn't use a 5-link. Instead, it has 3 active gems and 3 support gems in the same 6-link setup. So you have something that generates corpses, usually Desecrate, can be unearthed, and you have Detonate, Dead of Chain Reaction, and they're set up as payloads with Lancing Steel of Spraying being the delivery method for the cast on critical strike. Because no skill gem there is linked to 4 support gems, it doesn't show up on POE.Ninja. That said, I've checked the numbers of people playing this and it is number 1, albeit not by very much. If you want to find these builds, go to POE.Ninja and check the people out who are using the helmet, the 3 Dragons. This is not generally used anywhere else, but it's very, very good on this build, especially if you're playing in the solo self-found environment where other gear that might be better is a little bit harder to get your hands on. Note that this is not an Ignite build. There have been Detonate Dead Ignite builds that have been really good in the past, and in fact that will be on this list, but quite a way down. The thing about this build is it is all about the initial application of those Detonate Dead explosions, the first damage, the instantaneous damage that's done with that, and scaling that through critical strikes. Near universally, this build is being played on the Inquisitor because of the critical strike interactions that are available there. There is not a soul who's playing it on the Assassin. Secondly, we have another Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction build, but this one's quite different. This one is a critical strike oriented Necromancer. Now this tells a story here, and that is that people who are playing solo self-found are looking generally for ways to scale damage that is not based upon the weapon that your character's got. It's not based upon the explicit mods that are rolled on your character's weapon, it's instead based upon something else. For example, Corpse Life. Or you can get 1 or 2 mods on items, but you're not trying to get a whole bunch of mods that all multiply together on your weapon. The gearing for a build like this is very different to the gearing that's involved in a build that might want to get +1 to the level of all skill gems, +1 to the level of fire spell skill gems, and also fire dot multi on their same weapon. In any case, this is a very different build, even though it's the same skill. They're going to play completely differently, and so even though there's some similarities there, I'm definitely willing to call these different builds. Number 3 is the Archmage Hierophant. Now this is a versatile setup. There's a number of ways that you can have the Hierophant shell and the Archmage support gem, which is really, really powerful now, be used well together. There's 2 that have crystallized out as the best though. Number 1 is Frost Nova of Frostbolts, and number 2, quite a distant number 2, is Ball Lightning. There's a number of other things people are experimenting with, whether it be Crackling Lance, whether it be Arc, but these are miles behind, and the top 2 choices are now very, very well established for this build. One thing I like here is that this build scales on a lot of different axes to other builds, so it doesn't really scale with gem levels, it scales instead with totally different stats. Mostly it scales off mana. Number 4 is an oldie but a goodie, Righteous Fire. This skill is back from the dead. This was extremely unpopular to play in 3.23. It's not that it was any worse in 3.23 than it is now, it's just that in 3.23 it had just freshly been nerfed. People have realised it's actually still very, very playable. Now the Chieftain version has had a resurgence in popularity this league. It's important to note that this also shows up a bit underrepresented in POE.Ninja, and that's because there's 2 different versions of this build that I do consider to be the same build. One 6 links Righteous Fire and 4 links Fire Trap, the other 4 links Righteous Fire and 6 links the Fire Trap. When you combine these 2 together, you'll end up in position 4. It's worth noting that defensive setups that are used on this build vary tremendously. You can have a physical damage shifted into elements setup on a Chieftain, or you can have an armor-based setup. Both of them work, and it's probably the case that the physical damage shifting one is stronger overall. One thing I will note though is that there is literally no one in solo self-found using Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion, which is a completely different build. Although I would like to say to people that Indigon has now been confirmed as a drop from the regular version of the Uber Elder encounter, the standard Pinnacle boss, not the Uber Pinnacle boss. Even though I suspect that it is the rarest of the drops from the non-Uber version of the Uber Elder fight, and I've got to say that that is such a mouthful to say, non-Uber Uber Elder, that just sounds ridiculous. Rants about naming conventions out of the way, if you do happen to come across this particular item in solo self-found, one of the builds you could consider putting it to use in is Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion. Although that plays very, very differently to baseline Righteous Fire, it's just something that you could experiment with. So number 5 is an oldie but a goodie, Explosive Arrow Ballista Ignite. This is played both on the Champion Ascendancy and the Elementalist Ascendancy. I was actually considering splitting them into 2 separate builds, in which case the Champion would be a couple of notches down the list, and the Elementalist version would be right near the bottom of this list, or maybe just below the bottom. I eventually decided to consolidate them. One of the key things here is that this build has been solid for a very, very long time, and that means that there's a lot of well-established guides around for it. This is something that's kept it popular for a long time, because one of the few builds where you can take a guide that was written several patches ago and pretty much still use it verbatim today. Now in number 6 we have one of the Transfigured gems. This is Blink Arrow of Bombarding clones, but players generally term this build BAMA, for Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow. Now, you can use either Blink Arrow or Mirror Arrow of Bombarding clones. Both of them will work, and it just comes down to your personal preferences. Blink Arrow, though, is the overwhelmingly more popular choice because that way you are moving around while you're damaging enemies, which is always a good playstyle. This is a minion build that is a really interesting one because it uses an attack-oriented bow. Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow conjure clones of you that attack using a copy of your bow. Now, Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow have existed for a long time. Blink Arrow of Prismatic clones and Mirror Arrow of Prismatic clones are pretty mediocre, but Blink Arrow of Bombarding clones is just overtuned. It just does more damage than any comparable skill would do. Additionally, this is one of those gems where it's really easy to get a 20 quality version because there's a divination card that drops like candy from a few locations, and that divination card, while it turns in for the non-transfigured version, and of course when you do take it to the labyrinth, even if you get the right transfigured craft, there's a chance you'll end up with the prismatic clones version instead, but it still makes it easier than it is for most builds to get 20 quality on your main gem. And that's something that's a nice little bonus for a skill that would be used anyway. One quick little aside, if you're interested in Sanctum content, Hexblast Mines is the best build there. And one of the best things about that Hexblast Mine setup is that it is the Sanctum where it excels, and it is the Sanctum where its best in slot helmet, the Sandstorm Visage, is available. Let's round out the top 14 here. So we have Cast on Crit, Detonate, Dead of Chain Reaction, Inquisitor. We have Detonate, Dead of Chain Reaction, Manual Cast, Critical Strike, Necromancer. We have the Archmage Hierophant. We have Righteous Fire / Fire Trap. We have EA Ballista Ignite. We have BAMA, we have Lightning Arrow in 7, Detonate Dead again in position 8, this is the Ignite version of it, which is usually played Elementalist. 9 is Explosive Trap of Shrapnel, 10 is Elemental Hit of the Spectrum, the highest performing of the new gems, 11 is Boneshatter, 12 is Splitting Steel, 13 is Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, and in 14th position we have Exsanguinate Mines. I'll just finish with a couple of breakout uniques. The 3 Dragons is a real breakout unique here. This unique is common enough that you can rely on getting it in solo self-found, and it also allows Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction to apply Shock, which is a huge damage boost. Gifts from Above and Mindspiral are 2 single build uniques that have been way better than usual in this league as well. So final thought, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction is oppressively good in the narrow context of solo self-found. But ultimately, grinding gear games balance around Trade League. In Trade League, it's less oppressively good. It is still a very, very, very strong skill there, and it might well end up getting nerfed, but it's not as certain a nerf as, say, Tornado Shot Sniper's Mark package felt like it would be last league. That said, in solo self-found, if you focus only on the highest level characters, 95 plus or 98 plus, you'll see even more Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction. This is everywhere. It is absolutely and utterly omnipresent at the highest levels of play. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs and your Gravecrafts have interesting results.